much more interesting what Mr. Blair said in public, and he's been criticized much more for what he said deliberately on the podium of his party conference, which were the following words. Shortly after September 11th, he said, addressing our American friends, cousins, comrades, he said, "We were with you with the first, and we will be with you till the last." That surely is what friendship and solidarity actually mean. Sir Christopher Mayer, Geoffrey uses the euphemism gossipy for the tawdry little book that our former envoy here produced on this subject, said that when he heard the words, he began to feel uneasy because he said, words like that have consequences. You might be taken up on them. Well, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what is the point of making a declaration of unconditional brotherhood and solidarity if you're not prepared to be taken up on it? What's the value of your word? What, in fact, are your values, if such is not the case? The main sobriquet or epithet that Mr. Blair has reaped for this unequivocal position of friendship is the word poodle. There isn't a child in England who doesn't know how to repeat this childish accusation. Mr. Blair is Mr. Bush's poodle. They hear it from childish adults, they pick it up, and they giggle over it themselves. Well, let me just remind you of something. It was not Mr. Clinton or Secretary of State Albright who wanted to finish the job with Slobodan Milosevic and his mad dream of a greater Serbia and an ethnically cleansed and pulverized Balkans, a wave of fascism that would have spread into Hungary and Romania and Transylvania and beyond if it hadn't been, and perhaps into Greece and Turkish relations if it hadn't been contained. It was Prime Minister Blair who urged them to do it and said that British troops would be willing to do it even if American troops were not. This is not poodledom. This is not, I'll underline it, this is not poodledom. Mr. Blair demonstrated the same fortitude in the case of Sierra Leone when over the objections of almost everybody who thought, well, why not just leave a treaty torn up with an African country, former dependency of ours, founded to protect runaway and freed slaves? Why not let them be overrun by a Liberian invasion run by a group of hand-lopping thugs and irredentists with very strong ties through the diamond and blood diamond racket to Al-Qaeda? Who cares if we don't stand by the treaty? Anyway, it's not worth the life of a British grenadier. Mr. Blair took the view that was not the case, and at the cost of no casualties at all turned the invasion back, greatly, I think, to his credit. In the case of Afghanistan, as we know, he also said to President Bush that British troops were ready to intervene directly, not just by proxy through the Northern Alliance, whether American forces were available or not. But more important still, I think, in showing the puerility of this poodle charge, is the speech he gave in 1999 in Chicago. Actually, it was part of a series of speeches after the removal of Slobodan Milosevic from power. Mr. Blair repeatedly said, at a time when George Bush was a governor of Texas, preparing to run as an isolationist against the interventionism of Albert Gore and Bill Clinton, against the interventionism that Bush denounced and Cheney denounced in the debate, said, you're using American troops for nation building, you can't do that. You're using them for humanitarian purposes around the world. That's not what our 82nd Airborne is for. You're quite wrong. President Clinton and Vice President Gore had repeatedly sworn that there would be another appointment with Saddam Hussein that would have to be kept one time or another. But before that, Mr. Blair had said, we have one dictator down, we have another to go. There's an unpostponable confrontation with Saddam Hussein, and the only question is going to be, does he pick the timing of it, or do we? And just for once, we pick the timing. Up until then, Saddam chose. I know when I'll invade Iran. I know when I'll invade Kuwait. I know when I'll send death squads to hijack tourist boats in the Mediterranean. I know when I'll give sanctuary to the man who blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. I have the initiative here. I can switch allegiance from the PLO to Islamic Jihad and Hamas and pay for the suicide bombings in Palestine to keep the West off balance. I call the shots here. He decided when there'd be a crisis. Now, for deciding that for once we would pick the moment, we have never heard the end, and we never will hear the end from our favorite journalists and clever clogs types. Never hear the end of a campaign of slander and cynicism and defamation, because we produced the necessary evidence, because we said this man is a permanent menace with his genocidal politics, his weapons of mass destruction, his unending support for nihilism and terrorism, it's not just we've waited, we're doing this too quickly, it's that we've waited far too long. And for this, as I say, the campaign of hateful misrepresentation has never, and I think never will, stop. Proof positive, by the way, that history is not always written by the winners. The losers have written this, and I expect they will carry the day in the history books. Thus, I'll end with two ironies. Actually, Mr. Blair probably spoiled everything for the relationship and for himself by being untrue to the principles I've just described. He asked for, after the United Nations Security Council had voted unanimously, including the vote of Syria, to require, on pain of serious consequences, that Iraq, after decades of defiance, come into compliance with the relevant resolutions, not just on weaponry, but on many other things too. A resolution that good legal minds have said, and any moral sense would tell you, was self-enforcing and long overdue, and representing finally the unanimity that any organization of international stature with any vertebrae should have had to feel it had to pass. Syria, not exempted. Mr. Blair said, let's just try this again. Let's have another resolution because I need it for my parliamentary Labour Party. A rather parochial demand, amounting, if you like, to something of a quid pro quo, a political favour of a paltry kind. And because he's not a poodle and isn't regarded as such by the administration, that's another misrepresentation and libel, because they take him so seriously, because British advice is heeded, because British prestige does amount to something, because the Prime Minister is understood as a serious person, he was given what he asked. And therefore the whole noble enterprise of the removal of Saddam Hussein became a matter of nuts and bolts and details and matters of timing, exact locations of sources and methods of terror and WMD, trivializing the whole matter into one of inspections and reducing it to the very banal state in which the argument has declined today. Thus, Mr. Blair undid his cause and himself and his place in history, I think, not by being too much in line with the policy of the United States, correct as it was, but by being not so much so, insufficiently so.